Morning. Thank you all for being here. This is Carolyn Hazel and Rachael Zur. The show here is at Home with the Dead, and this is a project that's gone over about a year in the making. Not exactly collaborative, kind of meeting occasionally, looking at each other's work, and just with this conversation about everyday objects and spaces and how we connect through the dead, through those spaces, those objects. And after about a year, Carolyn and Hazel brought the project together and started to see how the language was speaking, like in dialogue, and saw how sort of organically and naturally they came together in this almost altar arrangement, and it became this greater whole. So I'm going to let Carolyn and Rachael tell you about the experience of it. But what they noticed is it helps, and what we saw last night was their own stories, their own experiences would come up through this. And so then that was kind of another greater whole of the project itself. So I'm curious to hear, their experience with that, and you're all at the end. There'll be time for conversation.
Thank you, Alon.
Yeah.
One of the things that kept coming up last night is this disbelief that we had been working independently. And there was one fellow who was like, no, you guys must have been talking and having lots of studio visits. But I think that one of the reasons that the show feels as cohesive as it does is that Carolyn and I both understand each other's visual language so well and modes of making. So I thought that for all of you, since maybe that's something that you and I kind of take for granted, working together, that it'd be nice to break down a little bit about process first, so that everyone is on the same page with where we've been sitting for more than a year with knowing about each other's practice. So,
Yeah. I mean, I do think there's something about that cohesiveness that can look like effortless, and it's so much more about a dialogue that evolves over time and then responding in real time to the visual information of the work. So there's actually quite a lot that came together at the very end when we did see the work together, and that really determined how we arranged things. They're placed much more closely than you would normally see the work of two separate artists into these groupings, and I think that shows that they are very thematically close, and works because they have that similar visual language. So to kind of talk a little bit about our iconography.
Yeah, we can start there.
Yeah.
I think that a recurring theme that's happening in the show that a lot of people were feeling that inclination to think that this had been so carefully planned is we're using these starburst forms. You can see them on top of Carolyn's urns or in this shape here, and connecting the humble object to these celestial bodies. The moon imagery you'll find in Carolyn's candle holders over on the pedestal there, or in my expanded painting behind me. Hands are a reoccurring motif in my work to signify care, and the care that's still felt in domestic spaces after someone passes away. That seems to be echoed in Carolyn's work with these coils, which you can really get a sense of her making something by hand.
Yeah, I think that when you were talking about the connection to the celestial bodies, with our iconography, there's also snakes that recur. There are these very archetypal images that are very familiar to us that aren't necessarily associated with any one artist or movement. They're just things that kind of, if you believe in the shared unconsciousness, that resonate across cultures and histories. But then I think what is unique and distinctive is that we have them cited in a domestic environment. So there are also these very mundane, chairs, couches, telephones, clocks, and then brought together in this kind of combination of very textured materials that really creates a sense of presence that kind of brings that. We've tried to bring that like quality of the space of the home as well as the sacred space. So with the altar arrangements, that's kind of touching on the sacredness, but then also the cloth, the textured nature, and then the textiles. Those are both some of the first materials that we encounter as people. You know, what happens to you when you're born, you're wrapped in a cloth. So it's this very elemental connection to that material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of want to go back and like chat a little bit
Yeah.
about materials
Yeah.
that we're using. I think that you could quickly say, oh, this is a mixed media sort of show, but my work is very much in the genre of expanded painting, and Carolyn's pulling in these ready-mades into these, I feel like they're small-scale installations, but would you categorize them as that or sculpture?
You know, I really am a little lost in there myself. It's relatively recent to bring in these ready-mades, and I'm still kind of alienated by it myself, even though I instinctively know that it feels right and true. Once you start using the word installation, to me that like sort of invites a lot of other things into the conversation. I'm not sure that I'm in that conversation yet,
Yeah.
but I'm kind of living in that ambiguity. So I don't reject that term at all. I'm just not quite sure.
I like the idea of thinking of small-scale installations, like very intimate installations for one.
Mm-hmm.
And then my work with expanded painting, for those of you who are not familiar with the term expanded painting, it's not something that I can take credit for coining. The theorist Mark Titmarsh has a book, Expanded Painting, and to just quickly break down what that is, it's painting merging and absorbing with other forms of art media. And that can be anything from photography to film. In my case, there's the merging and absorbing of qualities that appear to be ceramic, and then actual sculptural physicality that I'm bringing into the piece. But the work itself is very much about a relationship to the wall and pictorial problem solving and contour line.
I want to come back to the idea of the installation versus the altar, because of course now I'm like, my brain is chewing on that. And I think, you know, what you see in many cultures is that people do create altars in their home spaces, whether that's Dia de los Muertos, or I mean, it's very Catholic also to have this
Right.
sort of special sacred space. And I think, you know, to bring that kind of intention, I find that often people who buy pieces of mine, it's with that intent to create a space like that in their own home. And so I guess what I would love is for there to be a word that holds the intellectual capacity of installation, but also cites it in the home as like the place where that can kind of live and breathe and hold that specialness of space. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm like we're just gonna kind of ping pong off of each other. None of this is planned. So I think that's interesting to bring up with this show, because the conversations between the two of us and Alon, three very well-educated women, we could go very cerebral with this show, but I think that one of the things that the three of us became really interested in is making a way to honor the metaphysical, making a space to honor intuition, and that being another form of intelligence that we could bring to this, rather than just a academic, educated, dry sort of thing. So I feel like, why not just call them altars?
Yeah.
Just that could be what they are.
I love that.
But
They're altars. These are my altars.
But I do really value that about this exhibition, is being able to do something that's not just a very stereotypical gallery install of everything 60 inches center, and but something more intimate, where we created these, I feel like they're altars and shrines to paying homage to domestic space, to the spirits that live there, to the echoes of care that you feel from loved ones or strangers when you walk into a home where someone is felt as being simultaneously present and absent.
I think there's something that is very inviting in seeing people interact with this work. They are really drawn in by, there's an element of kind of coziness and a familiarity with some of the imagery. And then that creates the space for the conversation, which is, you know, can be quite a vulnerable conversation about death and loss. And so it's an opportunity to have that conversation, to be brought into it, but from a sort of gentle space, and kind of an aesthetic one that allows you to have that as a conversation that feels special, but not necessarily like heavy, I guess.
Yeah. I feel like you and I were really privileged last night to have these very intimate conversations that were sparked from the work of, as people were starting to decode like symbolism and iconography, there were individuals who would privately share with us stories about being in the home and family members that they had lost and their relationship to that space, and really connecting to what we were trying to say, but not having the binding it right there at the opening. And I've been just kind of thinking about that since last evening of what, how to generate that sort of space for people to do that. And this is still something I'm kind of working out, but I think it's about some of the aspects of the work being highly specific, and then other moments of ambiguity that are in it. And so this question of what does the artist reveal of their own personal narrative with loss, and what do they leave out so that the viewer is able to also access the work in that way?
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's true with both of our work, and that it is heightened together where there is a specificity of like this clock, this telephone, but then it stands in for, you know, all of the phones that a person has encountered in their life with the people, you know, that have passed on. And so it becomes like that specificity becomes a sort of portal into a broadened kind of sense of shared experience.
Yeah, it was fun watching last night too with people with Carolyn's work, depending on the generation of like either they weren't really sure about a phone like that, or they're like, this reminds me of Aunt, you know, so-and-so's phone, and connecting in that way. Or a lot of times I'm using the old 1970s flower sofa as a reoccurring theme in my work. And so depending on someone's generation, that they connect to it differently. There was something that they personally owned that was new to them at the time, or something that belonged to a grandparent, or they're really young, something that they're now it's a hot item that they can't seem to find in the vintage stores.
Yeah.
So I do feel like that's a fun thing as a contemporary artist, to not be so focused just on like how do I make contemporary work, but how do I source not just art history, but these vintage items that are maybe some people might feel like obsolete or a little wanting to shy away from.
Well, I think with phones and clocks, they're both, you know, things that we encounter all the time now, but in a digital capacity. And so as kind of analog, you know, dinosaurs, there's a connection to me between that kind of obsolete and then the symbolic like resonance that those objects can have when you kind of return to them as analog, separate from digital. I feel like that very like thinginess of them connects them more to the spiritual than like the disembodied nature of digital technology, I guess.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to a word that or a typo we were talking about recently of risky worth it, because I feel like that just kind of could maybe go back into talking a bit about process. But Carolyn and I were having a text exchange on something as we were getting ready for the show. I don't even remember what, but she meant to say totally worth it, and it came across as risky worth it, and I was like, that's brilliant. That describes everything in the artist's studio as risky worth it, of like these, you know, making a series of intelligent decisions. And then I find that for myself, sometimes those are the ones that get me further off track, and it has to be something more simple of like with this piece that has the mirror of very last minute cutting out a piece of paper that just seemed too fragile to be with the piece to come out of the snake, and that actually being what helped tie it together rather than something that was the next logical step.
Yeah, and that, I mean, risky worth it is the perfect description of like starting to bring in these, you know, these found objects, these ready-mades. I've been a lover of vintage and antique things my whole life. For me, that's like where I get into my Zen headspace, is an antique mall. And so that has like been a part of my identity that has had nothing to do with my art making practice for a very long time. And it was something about this last year and this work that, you know, I'm spending all this time crafting these objects, and then I'm just sort of like looking over at my shelf at like this old phone that I have, and I'm like, I don't understand why, but I need that to be involved somehow. And like that, like to let that happen was very much risky worth it. And then to trust that, you know, I mean, for some people it's very alienating and it's sort of a conversation stopper, but then for other people it's like the entry point for like let's have a conversation about cigar boxes and why they are included in this, grouping.
Should we open it up to Q&A?
Yes, let's do. Pepper us with your questions.
I'll go first. Well, I'm listening to your explanation, which really ties everything together. I was here for the beginning of last night, and I could tell the sense of, having been in this space multiple times, watching people look at art, people wanted to be in the space. Mm-hmm. Like they were invited in, and they were all having their own experience, even maybe before they were talking about it. So whether they knew it or not, whether it was, the telephone and the clocks and the stopped clocks and all of those things that mean something to somebody in a different way, and there's layers and layers, there's this nostalgia that I think takes you away from being overly concerned about whether mysticism is something, or if you're in a cerebral space or not, you're experiencing something. I could see where the audience could be like, oh, no, you definitely did this together. But yeah, I also can understand how just planning the show, I can see how certain things came about that came together naturally. And hearing you talk about it makes that even make more sense. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
So I guess it wasn't a question. It was just
made it easy for us.
Yeah. Well, I do think that, I want to give Alon a lot of credit for really encouraging us to collaborate in the way that felt right to us, and really ultimately gave us so much ownership over. I mean, we're both kind of like type A. We had already planned the whole floor plan a month ago, and Alon was so gracious about letting us come in and.
Which that kind of happened unexpectedly. It was more let's see some relationships between the work. Bring your work to my studio, just to kind of wrap our heads around what was going to happen. And then we were just playing with things in there and having a blast, and all of a sudden it was oh, we should do things like this. Oh, let's take a picture for Alon. Oh, here's another picture we need to take for Alon. And all of a sudden we were oh.
Are we overstepping?
Were we overstepping? We were. Thanks a lot.
It turned out so great.
No, but I do really appreciate your trust in us from the start. I remember when we showed you the works that could be the show very early on. Alon was okay, this looks great and we can do this, and then however things change, that would be great too. And not every gallerist is that way. You have some people who are no, it's gotta, this piece that you showed me absolutely has to be in it. So as things, that was, I feel over a year ago that we had that conversation. And then Carolyn and I were supposed to simultaneously be off at 2 different residencies making work for our shows. Carolyn went to hers, and I was supposed to be out at Stoveworks in Chattanooga, Tennessee last October, but for medical reasons couldn't go. And so Carolyn came back with this whole body of work, and I was what am I going to do? I'm behind. But what was great is what we had originally shown had a lot less color. It was going to be a lot more washed out, muted tones, and these warmer tones came into Carolyn's work, and that was a direction that I was excited to go in, not just for the show, but for myself and my own practice. So that was wonderful to not have those constraints and to just make the way I needed to make.
Yeah.
I thought of a question.
Yes.
How did you come up with a show title? Was that a collaboration? And okay.
Yeah.
So what was your thought behind it? I get it now that I'm standing in the space, but
we'd had some ideas that we felt
we did.
About.
And they were strong.
They were, yeah. But then we hadn't talked about it for a while, and then Alon messaged me, and she was like, "Hey, can you confirm the name of the show?" And I was like, "Oh shit!" We actually didn't land on something for certain, and then it just came to me. It just was one of those thank you, universe. And what I love about that title, At Home with the Dead, is it's almost feels like a pun. It's charming, but it carries the weight of the thematic content of the show. And I love that as a prepositional phrase. It is about holding the space for the thing. So it's actually doing as a title what we're trying to do, grammatically, what we're trying to do with the work in the space. So I love that when there's formal symmetry like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can also see there's a lot of symmetry in the show, so as a visual quality as well. There's something sort of elegant and elevated about that felt like a really nice match.
I immediately fell in love with it because of, for personal reasons, not just the symmetry of it, but my late father was a ceramicist who showed his work throughout Oregon and Northern California, and he passed away when I was 4 months old. So his ceramics were my only way of like really knowing his thinking, was to be able to put my hands on that work and the indentations, and that being the closest way for my hand to hold his. And growing up with those in the home that I grew up in, it just felt like that's what I lived.
Yeah.
And that was, I feel like, the very beginning of my art education, be it not formal, but the true beginning of an object teaching me about someone else's thought process.
And that's beautiful, which I actually like, kind of knew, but like you saying it like that, I really see that, like the depth of that connection, which is really wonderful. I think another layer with that title is it brings in something that we both personally value, which is this idea that conversations about death are just more fraught than they should be. Or maybe that's too judgy of a way to say it, but that we hopefully as people can have richer and more complex conversations about death as a natural part of the human experience. And so that means that just the comfort with the willingness to engage with death and conversations around death, which we, and there were hugs and tears and stories last night. It was really wonderful to share in that with people who felt safe to share those things and to have those experiences in the space.
I think that getting comfortable with grief and with death then allows for these metaphysical properties that I'm interested in and you're interested in to be more accessible to people, of when we're not powering through grief as like, I gotta get through all those steps as fast as I can, and just being, then there's these echoes of love that we can feel, and it's bittersweet, it's sad, but the love that was shared in domestic spaces, it doesn't go away. Love is a verb. It's the actions of care that we give to other people. Those actions are us, generating an energy that's in the room, and energy can't be destroyed. It's forever. So if we can get more comfortable with the discomfort of grief, then I think that we can access this other whole rich way of being.
Snaps for that. Any other questions?
Have you called the number?
I have not, although, oh my gosh, how did I miss out on that? Yeah, because that one was a antique store find. There's an amazing so we have both been to the Southwester doing artist residencies at separate times, and that was also kind of this interesting thread that ran through. But there is a bananas, I don't know if you can call it an antique mall. It's like a crumbling warehouse.
Oh, that place, and the guy
it's like very, but anyways, I found it there, and it was complete. It was like gray. It was so dirty and dusty, but somehow that yellow would shine through, and so that's where that one came from.
Yeah, no, we do have a bit of Southwester in the show, because my piece over there on the blue wall, that was made in March at Southwester, and the same with the clock, and so it's also this fun thing of, we never got to go to Southwester at the same time, but
that place
does have an energy for anyone who's been, and it does get into the work.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, he put the number in his phone, so he'll call
Fantastic.
it later.
Back,
She
please.
wouldn't let it go.
I love it. Oh my gosh.
I can speakerphone
Now all
right
these people are going to be calling this for
Right.
And then actually, if somebody answers, I'm like, we have your yellow phone.
If you want it back, you just come to the gallery and pay.
Well, thank you so much for coming this morning and for being a part of this show and conversation.
Well, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.